All right. Good evening, everybody. We'll start with roll call. Mr. Trumbull?
Trumbull here.
Siegel here.
Schwartz here.
Danaher here.
Forstell here.
Johnston here.
All right. First agenda item is comments from the public. We have a distinguished visitor, Victor Ojakian, former council member, long-term council member, and former mayor. Vic? All right.
Sorry, I didn't realize coming back to the council chambers that I have so many people to talk with. I'm here for a simple reason, as I mentioned to a couple people before. When I was on the city council in the 2000s, we had the Western Area Powers Association contract come in front of us, and we renewed it. When we renewed it at the time, we were asked to move the process forward because of the fact that the federal government was talking about not allowing people to agencies like us to renew. And the theory was at the time that we were getting that energy at a far better price than other people. It's why we were better off as a community in terms of our electricity costs versus PG&E communities. So I was fortunate enough, by the way, on the way over here to run into my good friend over here, Shiva, and he was talking with me about some of the changes in the energy costs. But I know that contract expires, because I was there, expires in 2024, and I understand that there's some question about, in the negotiations, about what the cost will be for what we get. So why am I here? I don't think the general public understands the significance of that contract, and frankly, 4 or 5 years out isn't that much time. So I'm hoping this commission not only obviously discusses and keeps on top of and makes sure that we do something about that contract, but that we're transparent about it, so that the majority of Palo Altans understand what the impact could be on their electricity costs. So one last comment. I was on the council when I started off, the cost for gas was this. When I started to leave, we were using these concepts like the laddering concept to get something that was expensive because we thought it would be even far more expensive, so it wasn't necessarily the best formula. But I think a lot of people were shocked by what happened. So I just want to make sure that you keep the public informed and be as transparent and make sure that people on the city council get information from you and talk about this more, so there's no surprises. And I'm happy to see you again, Mike.
All right.
And I'll end my comments.
Good to see you. You're right. It's a major contract for the city, probably the largest the city has in any domain. It's going to need a lot of attention.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Okay.
And
all right.
To that point, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, and former Mayor Jackin, now you may not be aware that it's actually agenda item number 1 on our agenda this evening, and subject to the commission's discussion, we'll also be reporting to the council's finance committee shortly. So it would definitely front and center on upcoming discussions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. We have 2 minutes for approval. The August 28th and September 5 minutes. Are there any comments on the minutes? Judith?
So on the one that's, sorry, I should have to use my glasses. On the one that is the September 5th one, on page 6, it says, in the second paragraph, the DOE is developing a voluntary code of conduct, and it's already been developed. So the
DOE has developed.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and it's actually an industry-led group facilitated by DOE has developed. So if that could just be corrected, please.
All right. We'll put that in the past tense. Are there any other comments in the minutes? there-
With that one change, I'll, what do I want to say, move
Move to approve.
acceptance of the 2 sets of minutes.
All right.
Can we do them separately? Because I
Sure.
feel I need to abstain from the one I wasn't present at.
All right. For the August 28th minutes, then, a motion to approve?
Well, I move to approve the August 28th
All
minutes.
right. Second?
See,
All right. All in favor?
I,
Aye.
And I'll abstain on that because I was not present.
Okay, all right. So noted. And on the September 5, Terry already made a motion. I'll second that. And Warren, I understand you want to abstain. Anybody else in favor?
I,
Okay, all right, those are done. I don't think we have any agenda changes here, unless any members, so move on to reports from the commissioner. Or commissioner meeting, pardon me. Yeah, you're not going to disappoint us, I hope,
No,
Judith.
I've got 3 this time. One was a webcast for the Low-Income Community Solar Working Group, and this was to go over some ideas that we were calling Community Solar for Community Action. And so we had 3 speakers from different jurisdictions around the country looking at different ways you could approach community solar so that it actually ended up, rather than looking at it as a subscription model, you did it in such a way so that it actually, the way the solar was monetized, it could then be used to support other programs that were sort of done carefully in a fund accounting sort of way, as a way to underwrite support programs. And so that was a very interesting, and it's on audio recording, so if anybody's interested, just send me an email and I'll point you to it. Then I went down to Solar Power International, which is an overwhelmingly huge show that, like CES is bigger, but it's bigger than Distributech. It's a really huge show. And what was interesting, I think, for the purposes of this group is that not only were there a lot of, where you could really see the maturity of the market in terms of different technologies and different scales, whatever, but storage and microgrids were very much a part of what people were talking about. And I think the concept that all of this stuff has to work together, that you can't just look at things in isolation, has really become sort of baked into how people are looking at it, that you really can't sort of look at it in isolation. And then I went from there to the Low Income Community Solar Working Group workshop that I led, where we were trying to get consensus on how do you, again, how do you make access to solar available to more low and middle income residents. And what was interesting about the discussions is the people who were the solar advocates were unwilling to entertain any model that was not a subscription model. There was like this incredible resistance, okay? And for getting certain people involved who can't afford it, it's really important. And I think that for us, even though we want to look at Palo Alto as an affluent community, I think we have to be aware that there are people who really are on the edge. And if they want to participate, we may want to look at some of these other models because they help with resiliency. They help with other kinds of things. And I think particularly as a city that, as we talked about last time, where trees are really important and having shade is one of the things that makes this a wonderful community where you don't have to have air conditioning and you can use less electricity. That the idea of the creative ways we can approach community solar for other reasons than strictly it's the cheapest cost of getting electricity is really something we need to take into account. And so again, I think there are models that are coming out there, especially for like multifamily housing. There were some really interesting things. And so that integrate different technologies. And I think we're in a time period where there's a lot of creativity happening. And it would be nice if our staff and our commission could sort of get some visibility into what's happening.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Anybody else with reports? Gary.
So on September 24th, Lena Perkins of our staff came to my energy policy class, and she did a wonderful job. She even explained what Mayor Ojakian was talking about to the class. So I was going to say nice things about her, but I noticed her in the audience, so I'm not going to do that. I will add, if you want to feel better about Lena's presentation as well as the August 28th program, I gave a quiz question, which they turned in Monday, so I've only graded 10 of them, to compare the pros and cons of investor-owned utilities and municipal-owned ones. And for some sick reason, they all think municipal's better. So, such is my report. I'll try to be nicer next time.
All right, excellent, thank you. Ed, you have a report, General?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. A few things to report on. Let's see. First off, next week is Public Power Week and Public Natural Gas Week. And so I'd like to note that on your calendar. These are two national campaigns organized to build awareness of the benefit of public utilities. More on the same drumbeat there. Our community-owned utilities been powering Palo Alto for over 100 years, with our electric utility founded in the year 1900, followed in 1917 by our natural gas distribution system. Forward-thinking of two Stanford University professors, Charles Daddy Marks and Charles Benjamin Wing, who are largely responsible for the emergence of the municipally owned utility service. Marks and Wing advocated that the city could provide utility services at rates significantly below those of those charged by the private companies. And the city's utility customers benefit from both local control and policy setting, community values driven programs and services, as well as support for city services. Let's see. In prep for next week, you can follow us on social media with the hashtag #CommunityPowered, and help us spread the word about the programs and services make Palo Alto a unique place to live and work. Let's see, a couple of upcoming programs. First, beginning this month, our home efficiency genie house call refund. Palo Alto residents in the month of October, beginning the month of October, will be able to get a full refund on the cost of a home efficiency genie house call if they complete the qualifying home efficiency improvements within 90 days of their assessment. The refund will be covered by Clear Result, the city's contractor for the Genie program. This offer is intended to encourage action following on energy efficiency upgrades in line with the city's sustainability goals. Also note that Palo Alto Unified School District has continued and made progress on its solar program. On Friday, September 29th, utilities joined PAUSD staff at Nixon Elementary School to talk about their recently installed solar photovoltaic arrays at the school. School district staff have arranged assemblies for students in kindergarten through 5th grades. Solar now provides enough electricity to meet all the school's electricity needs, equivalent to powering about 38 average Palo Alto homes. Nixon is one of 6 school sites the district has or is installing solar. I recognize hasn't been without some hiccup, has nonetheless demonstrated some progress in this area. Would note upcoming events in October, and I'll just hit them really quickly. Emergency Preparedness and Crime Prevention Fair on Saturday, October 13th, 10 a.m. to noon at Lucy Stearns Community Center. Another is an electric vehicle right for you? On Tuesday, October 23rd, 5:30 to 7:30 at Mitchell Park Community Center. And irrigation equipment upgrades and landscape water use efficiency on Saturday, October 27th, from 9 a.m. to noon at the Palo Alto Arts Center auditorium. And finally, would note with our ongoing upgrade downtown infrastructure project on University Avenue that we are continuing with the work there. We are finishing some of our road closures on the Bryant to Ramona area for restoration work, while the fenced-off area has moved now to Ramona to Emerson section. Current plan is to complete the joint trench work up to Emerson prior to Thanksgiving, so complete by November 16th. Work will continue on the Emerson to High Block after the first of the year. So we'll do a hiatus during the holiday period between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Would note that you may have heard that yesterday there was a gas leak that our contractor discovered, and I use the term discovered, in that it was determined that this was a previously cracked PVC gas main that was uncovered when the contractor disturbed the soil around the crack, and that led to the leak, which further evidence to support the importance and time sensitivity of the risk assessment and replacement work that we have ongoing. So that completes my report.
Thank you. Any commissioner comments today? All right.
Can I just question about the downtown upgrade? Is that basically on schedule at this point?
We are within working days. We had hoped to complete all of the work on University by the Thanksgiving holiday, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. So we will come in back after the first of the year. So, we're tracking and pushing that along, but again, we're still within contract days. And we'll have to keep on them to ensure that remains the case.
Okay. All right. We'll go on to the first item then, which is action item on the electric integrated resource plan.
Go ahead.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jonathan Ine, Assistant Director of Utility Resource Management. I want to introduce Jim Stack, Senior Resource Planner, who spoke to you last month. We also have in the audience, I believe, Lena Perkins, based on Commissioner Trumbull's comments, and Shiva Swaminathan, Senior Resource Planner, who are also
Didn't she leave in tears?
deeply integrated resource plan. I just want to note this is adoption. This is intended to be adoption after some discussion last month. This is a list of major strategic initiatives, and there will be opportunities to discuss all of the topics at future dates based on the schedule for the EIRP. So with that, turn it over to Jim.
Great, thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Jim Stack here again to give you another report on the 2018 Electric Integrated Resource Plan, hopefully for the final time. As Jonathan mentioned, we were here last month with a fairly extensive report and discussion about this item. At that point, I showed you kind of gave you a rundown of the whole report and went over the objective and strategies and work plan. The only thing missing last night was the full report itself, because we were still finalizing that and getting it reviewed by legal and other folks internally. So I am back tonight with the full document. And since we've already kind of covered this at some length, I'll keep tonight's presentation fairly brief. I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of the SB 350 requirements for integrated resource planning and an overview of the objective and strategies and work plan again. And I'll highlight one change in the work plan that we made following last month's discussion here with all of you. And then I'll leave you with our recommendation. So as you know, we've been doing integrated resource planning here in Palo Alto for many years, most recently under the framework of the Long-Term Electric Acquisition Plan, or LEAP, with the last one being approved in 2012. Then in 2015, SB 350 was passed, and it established new requirements on integrated resource planning for large utilities like us, namely that we submit an IRP to the CEC every 5 years, with the first one being due in early 2019. And of course, SB 350 also established aggressive statewide targets related to renewables, greenhouse gas emissions, and energy efficiency. and all of which we have to discuss in our IRPs. On this slide, this is just a laundry list of all the topics that we're required to address in our IRPs. And I've put check marks next to them to show that we do address them in our document. There is one question mark next to the energy efficiency item because that requirement is a sector-wide target requirement, and we're still kind of waiting for the CEC to establish the regulations about what actually is included and not included in that definition, and whether or not there will be utility-specific targets. So that's a bit up in the air. And then in addition to those, the CEC also gave us a set of 4 standardized tables that we're required to submit to them, just to provide them some more visibility into the actual details of our supply and load forecasts going out to 2030. And then in addition, we're also required to submit an updated version of our RPS procurement plan to the CEC to reflect the SB 350 changes in the renewables requirement. That's a document that we first adopted in 2011 after the state's 33% RPS law took effect. It also usually goes hand in hand with another document, the RPS enforcement program. And SB 350 doesn't require us to submit an updated version of that, but they usually go together, so we updated ours anyway, and that's included in the big packet before you tonight. And since we've already kind of covered all that covers the background, and hopefully you've had a chance to review the EIRP report itself. I won't go through that document page by page, but I at least wanted to put up the table of contents here on the screen just to give you all a sense of the structure of the document and see if you have any questions or things you'd like to discuss. But essentially the gist of the report is that it kind of goes into detail on the state of our current supply portfolio as of 2018, and that's represented by the pie chart on the left of the screen. And then we sort of describe how we expect our portfolio to look out in 2030 and discuss the big decisions that we have to make between now and then. As we've discussed many times, and as our former mayor alluded to a few minutes ago, the big decision that we're facing in this period over the next few years is the decision of whether to renew the Western base resource contract in 2025 for an additional 30-year period. So we'll be tackling that issue and coming back to you with a lot more on that in the subsequent years. But that uncertainty around that decision is represented in the pie chart on the right by the unknown carbon neutral area of that graph. So as you can see, it's a large chunk of our overall portfolio. And then just one final reminder, even though energy efficiency is an element of the report, the IRP is not getting into energy efficiency program planning. That's not really the purpose. It's more about our supply resources. And so that's really all I'll say about the report itself right now.
Can I just ask a question about that previous
Sure.
slide? So does your recommendation suggest that we should get rid of Western, or is that one of the things we're going to discuss? Is this an if, or is this what you're saying should happen?
The report highlights that as a discussion that we need to have in the subsequent years. The base case that we're presenting, the kind of the default scenario, if you will, is that we do renew the contract, but we do take a look at our alternative options and highlight that we'll be coming back to you with much more on that later.
Since we're on that topic, I was going to get to it when we talked about topics for future meetings, but this is a 5 to 7 year process is what you say in this. And there ought to be some periodic update on the process, contracting issues and analysis every 6 to 12 months or whatever as we go forward, partly so that you leave the commission more educated as it goes along to consider. It's an important decision.
Certainly, yeah, we'll be happy to do that. Okay, and now I'll quickly go over the EIRP objectives, strategies, and work plan, including the one change we made to the work plan following last month's discussion. The EIRP objective was modeled after our utilities mission statement, which we adopted in the 2018 strategic plan. And then we have the 9 strategies for carrying out that objective listed here. That's just for your reference. We haven't made any changes to these items here following last month's meeting, so I won't go over all of them again in detail unless you have any questions. Next, I'll highlight the 7 new initiatives listed in the work plan that we're planning to undertake over the next few years. First, of course, is the Western contract decision. And then directly related to that is the portfolio rebalancing analysis. Then we have the decision about what to do with the California-Oregon transmission project. That asset will come back to us in 2024. And then we have the carbon accounting methodology discussion, which we've talked about a few times already. And so on this one, this is where the change is. I wanted to highlight, in addition to considering changing the methodology that we use for accounting for the carbon in our portfolio, we're also planning on addressing how the city communicates with customers about and the public about the carbon content of our portfolio. So we'll include that in our list of items to discuss in the future. Next, we have the RPS compliance strategy analysis, and then an initiative related to partnering with external agencies, such as community choice aggregation organizations. And finally, undertaking a long-term competitive assessment of the utility within the context of the proliferation of DERs in our territory.
Can I ask a question about that? So, okay, I didn't realize that it was specifically about CCAs.
It's not specifically about CCAs, it's including...
Because I can't imagine what they bring to the party for us.
Well, they could bring, it could mean new counterparties for us to work with, new suppliers to trade with. There could be opportunities to partner on programs for customers. It's something we're going to explore. We're not saying that we're going to do anything at this point.
An example is if throughout the Bay Area, every CCA is they're aligning the way they deliver a certain type of EV program, for example. It may be worthwhile for Palo Alto to join up with a partnership of that sort. So we just look out for opportunities like that.
Next, just to kind of bring things full circle, this slide is one that we presented to you in our first EIRP presentation way back, I think it was June of last year, where we listed kind of all the major topics we plan to address in the report itself. And I think you'll find that we did address these in the report and the objective and strategies and work plan. And then with that, our next steps are to take this document, the IRP, and the related documents to the Finance Committee and Council for review, and then to submit them to the CEC, the required documents anyway, early next year. And then we'll begin working on the new initiatives listed in the work plan, and we'll be updating you on our progress with those periodically over the next few years. And then, of course, we'll be starting the whole process again in a few years, so it's something to look forward to. So with that, I will leave you with our formal recommendation, which is that we recommend that the UAC recommends that Council, the Finance Committee recommends that Council adopt a resolution approving the 2018 EIRP and the standardized tables, the RPS procurement plan update, and the RPS enforcement program update, and also approve the EIRP objective and strategies and the EIRP work plan. So, thank you very much.
All right. Questions or discussion from commissioners?
I guess I appreciate that added sentence about communicating to the community, and I was not able to be here at the last meeting. I did watch it, and I appreciate the dialogue that also went into that issue.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is kind of a minor question, but in describing our existing resources, in several places you described them as fully deliverable. I just wasn't sure what that term meant. Is that the same thing as dispatchable, or?
No, it's different. Fully deliverable is a definition that the California Independent System Operator, the grid operator, uses to describe resources where essentially we can count on them for reliability purposes. They, I guess you could say, in periods of stress on the grid, we can count on them to be delivered. There are no sort of network issues or constraints around them that would prevent them from being delivered to customers during periods of high demand or congestion on the grid. There are other resources that are considered energy only, where we get to count the energy, but we can't count the capacity towards our resource adequacy requirements. Fully deliverable resources, we are allowed to use their capacity for meeting our resource adequacy requirements with the ISO.
So what percentage of our current supplies are fully deliverable?
All of our resources except for 2 solar projects. And we're working on that with the developer, trying to submit them to the ISO so they'll achieve fully deliverable status.
I have some comments, but that's my
Okay,
question.
why don't, let's have.
Well, one of the things that going back to your pie chart slide, which I thought was interesting, if I did the math correctly, I think what this shows is our average cost in cents per kilowatt hour is 5.9 cents per kilowatt hour across the portfolio. And the only resource that's below that average is the Western resource. And obviously we don't know what Western would be going forward, but it means that if you take that low cost resource out of the base, that's going to have a big impact on our overall. So I was kind of struck by that. The other thing is that I didn't see, and I understand that this is something you'll be working on. At least I didn't see a lot in the report talking about the kind of the second goal, portfolio rebalancing, and how we could do that, how we could replace existing resources with resources that more closely matched our load. I know that this isn't the final report, but it seems to me that you've got 2 parallel tracks here that you have to go down concurrently. One is to figure out what you can do with the Western contract to try to make it more favorable to Palo Alto, but you also need to know what the alternatives are. So because it's not enough just to conclude that the Western isn't favorable, we've got to supply that big chunk of electricity, and obviously we want to do it in a way that's going to satisfy this portfolio rebalancing. So you have a lot of work ahead of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good issue of how much of that to include in the IRP is one we kind of struggled with. We felt ultimately that we actually did a lot of analysis on that question earlier this year. We had some consultants we worked with, and we presented some more than what we showed in the EIRP itself. I think back in June, we did a report and discussion with you about the work that we did. Ultimately, we felt it was sort of a little bit in a tangent from what the CEC was looking for in the EIRP, and didn't need to get into that sort of discussion with them. But we will certainly be following up on that issue in the next couple of years and doing more, looking at that.
So that's something we can look forward to hearing more about.
Yep, much more.
Okay, so on page 2 of the plan document, okay, I saw that it says for transportation electrification, the target was 90% EVs by 2030. And I just think that is not a realistic assessment for human behavior. And to imagine that the residents of Palo Alto are going to all give up Audis and BMWs and non-electric luxury vehicles is, or pickup trucks, I just don't think is realistic. And if our numbers are dependent on 90%, it's one thing for you guys to say, we're going to take our entire fleet and make it into EVs. That you can control. This is other people's behaviors, and I just don't think that, I think that's setting yourself up for a target that can't possibly be met. I don't know who set the target, but.
So this did come from our citywide sustainability climate action plan, and I think it'd be fair to call it an aspiration goal. It really doesn't, excuse the pun, drive our activities other than to do what we can to facilitate that market adoption.
Okay, so the reason why I think it's relevant to this discussion is if you were going to try and do something like that, the amount of incentives that you would have to require that the cost of which that would have to be socialized across the entire city would be enormous, okay? So if you even wanted to get 50%, we'd have to be offering rebates that are way in excess of what PG&E does, and other people would have to pay for it. And so I just wonder whether that's really...
So actually, a bit of this in this area, and had discussions on it this afternoon. The projections are that EVs will be cheaper than by 2025.
Well, even if companies that are promising they're going to have a cheaper car come through, I think it is not realistic about the demographics of this community to think that everybody wants to drive an EV. And I think it is, I think if you're making your plan based on that, you either have to say you're building in incentives to get people to do it, or you have to have a more realistic goal. So I don't know whether I can influence that, but that's sort of my thought.
It's a fair point, and I think this doesn't say whether it's about new cars or whether it's about the fleet, because the fleet rolls over very slowly. But in terms of if we want to enable it, certainly thinking of charging networks is part of that.
So it may be that talking about this goal, this is really just inventory of goals from other.
Okay.
These aren't goals set by the IRP. These are goals from other plans. This one is, as General Manager Shikata said, was set by the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan. And so when that returns, that might be the appropriate time to talk about that goal. Jim, I think you could speak to whether this is actually, whether 90% penetration is actually in our projections, which I don't think that it is.
No, that's not what we're assuming for 2030. I think 15? 4. We're assuming 4% of residential customers adopt EVs.
Which is the percentage of new cars last year that were...
40.
Yeah.
Sorry, 40.
But we're electric and plug-in hybrid, I guess, in Palo Alto.
I think even that is ambitious. Okay. On without incentives, okay? Then on page 10, again, there's the pie chart that shows the Palo Alto power supply in 2012 and 2018. Okay, is that strictly what you're buying, what you have on record as buying? Because again, I would be really curious as to how much of that, the thermal, we're still buying to be able to keep the lights on at night. And again, gets into the transparency issue that, even if we've got it down to 30% or 20% or whatever it is, I think that this is a misleading chart because it says in 2018, we don't have any. And it isn't true. So why can't we just say what it is? So that people understand the choices they're making.
Sure. Yeah, that chart shows net purchases. So it doesn't show the gross purchases we make in certain hours and the sales. But that's all part of the carbon accounting discussion, I think, that we'll be having in the next year or two.
Okay. Then on page 15, one of the things that I didn't see in there that I think could be really useful is the idea of, time varying rates that are enabled by AMI. So if we're going to have this infrastructure, we now can give price signals to try and give people incentives for different kinds of behavior that we want them to do. So that's a really positive thing that I think we should put in there, because I think it's, it justifies why the Finance Committee should support investment in this area. So I think it's a financial.
Yeah. I think that is something that we forward in our DER plan, which is coming next.
Okay, and maybe
next
I
month.
just missed it. I realize that it's dense, so I may have missed
No,
it.
you didn't miss it. It'll be talking about the DER plan component of this next month. So this plan is really fun. Applying into this. The distributed resources to substitute for electric supplies is acknowledged in here, but really the details are in the
Well, I'm
DER
thinking of
plan
it in terms of varying rate, give people incentives to use less. Right now, we're dependent on the goodwill of interested people to not use electricity at a certain time of day. Okay? Right now, it has to be just a completely voluntary thing. There is a large portion of the population where you need to give them a financial reason. And I think we will find in Palo Alto that there will be people that will change their behavior if they get money for it. I mean, that's been demonstrated in other jurisdictions. It's not like we're going to be the first ones. And wealthy people are often very much motivated by it. It's not something that because we're an affluent community, we're going to be exempt. So I just think that it's an important thing to have visible, that's all.
Commissioner, you're absolutely right, and we'll
Okay.
be talking about it in November.
Okay.
That
Then I have a
topic.
question. What percent of our population is on REAP, which is on page 22, on our low-income plan that we're giving? Do we have any, idea?
It's a fairly low percentage, but I'd have to get back to you with exact
Because I'm going to
percentage.
throw something out there that maybe one of the reasons why we're able to offer electricity cheaper than PG&E is because they have 40% of their population that's on their care plan. And if we have like 5% or 2% or whatever it is, then that may in fact be where a lot of our bump comes from. And so then I guess I also, on page 24, which I brought up my other question, what would we replace Western Hydro with? And I think, again, one of my concerns that I see happening industry-wide, not just picking on Palo Alto, is there's this massive hand-waving that says, oh, we don't know what it's going to be, but we're going to get rid of our nuclear and we're going to get rid of our large hydro, and now we're going to magically have this zero-carbon electricity. And I just don't believe that. And I think we shouldn't hand wave. And so that's why I asked the question when you said what you will replace it with versus if we really don't have any idea, and I would hope we don't hand wave, I guess would be my, and that, again, when you get to page 41, it's again the supply mix in 2030, this idea of undetermined, carbon neutral. Again, I think this is one of the places that you can do a really important service to not just the community and not just to Palo Alto, but to the industry at large, is that if our city council understands that what we're doing to be a modern industrialized society requires certain kinds of investments or support of things, and they can support more low carbon or zero carbon, requests they don't shut down Diablo Canyon, things like that, that I think it would be good if Palo Alto was on the side of really explaining these things to people, because again, the conferences I go to, I just see people just making stuff up. they don't, and so you guys have to keep the lights on. This is what I feel like a big part of our UAC meetings are communicating with you guys. So I just want to say, I want to express my support for telling the truth and telling what really is realistic, so that you don't find yourself in handcuffs where like people say, well, every fourth house gets to have electricity at night because we can't keep the lights on for everybody. And I think if our city council doesn't understand it, they can be in the same camp that makes these sort of pronouncements that are very aspirational but aren't realistic. So I'd like us to be the leaders in realism.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll take that to heart in the initiatives.
Lauren. Please. Lisa, pardon me, Lisa.
That's quite all right.
Lisa.
At risk of just trying to restate the obvious, the EIRP that we are asked to recommend, that the Finance Committee recommend that the City Council adopt, it's sort of many pages sort of describing what is now, and then many pages describing strategies of how to, like laying out, these are the questions that need to be answered, here's the strategies for thinking about them. But there's nothing in here that's like, this is the Newt portfolio, here is the recommended decision on the Western contract, and so forth. Okay, so it's sort of, I don't want to be flippant, but there's sort of no actual decisions. It's sort of like what the council adopts, if they adopt it, is a strategy for answering a specified set of questions.
Yes, it's a problem statement, and it's essentially an acknowledgement that these are the priority strategic questions for us to focus on the next several years.
Okay. Then my only follow-up question is, in the tables that are in the appendix, for example, the energy balance table sort of includes projections of a certain amount of energy and capacity coming from the Western base resource in years past 2024. So we're not supposed to take that literally, because that sort of assumes a decision having been made about the Western contract. And those are placeholders for carbon neutral energy to be determined?
Essentially, yes. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the default scenario we're showing here, which we had to show something to the CEC, and the default scenario is that we do maintain the Western contract. But it's not, a decision that we've made.
But it's not a commitment to
No.
the CEC that those contracts will be maintained?
Correct, no.
Thanks, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, Jonathan and I talked about this Tuesday. It's partly to meet regulatory requirements and partly to identify areas that the staff has to work on. And I think you've done a good job in that. And I'm not discounting any of the comments that have been made here, but it does do that. What I didn't realize when I spoke to you Tuesday was that what was distributed did not include attachment C, which is the work plan. Your PowerPoint here had new initiatives that I guess get added to the work plan. But although it didn't come in my packet then, all right. Back of attachment.
It's here.
I mixed attachment B then, thank you. All right. So I guess would be what I'd request at some point in the months ahead, you integrate some of this with the calendar so we have a sense of timetable for addressing some of these issues, understanding that some may be addressed over 5 years, but updates on that. And these are all very important issues you've identified and ones of interest to the commission. And I
Sure,
think
we'll
you've
do
done
that. Thank you.
I think you've done a very good job putting this together.
Thank you.
So, please, Lisa.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, to chime in, I think you've done a great job identifying what are the key issues and questions to be answered and ways to think about them. So I very much appreciate having been able to be a part of the, multiple session-long process working this out, and I think it's a great document.
Thank you. It's been a good experience for us, too, to go through it with you guys.
So I want to acknowledge Commissioner Schwartz's point about making sure, not that it requires an amendment here or change, but making sure we do present and keep track of what are our fossil fuel purchases, even though we're getting offsets for them. But I would ask the commissioners if, acknowledging that there's a lot of work to be done on these topics and some items to be dealt with in the DER, to be fleshed out in years to come, people satisfied with the report, the plan as is, and would anybody want to move for approval of the recommendation?
So I will move approval of the staff request, but include a statement that this is not a project under CEQA. It's the same thing the staff report says. The way the rules work is you have to make a determination about the California Environmental Quality Act before you can make a decision. So I'm just supporting the staff determination that this is not legally a project under CEQA.
Okay.
And then moving the recommendation.
Could you move to the screen that has the requested action, please? And so is there any comment from the staff on if we note in here that this is not a project under CEQA?
So it's the bottom of page 7.
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure, that is mentioned in the staff report.
But you want it mentioned in the resolution too, or just?
Well, the way I learned it, and I apologize for being an environmental lawyer, is you have to make your CEQA determination before you're allowed to do anything else.
So are you suggesting you move the staff recommendation plus the language under the environmental review heading
Right.
under the staff report
it's a
on page
recommendation.
7 of the staff report?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the recommendation, I think, asks you to ask that the council adopt a resolution, and the resolution includes the CEQA language that you're referring to, I think.
As long as it's first.
Okay.
You're not allowed to do CEQA without deciding it first.
All right. Well, can we ask that you confirm with your city attorney how it should be worded to meet that requirement? And subject to that comment and dealing with what's needed, is there a motion to approve the plan? Judith, second? Second. All in favor?
I'm not trying to be picky, but
No,
the
no,
motion I made
No, I want
was the
them to.
exact same thing with CEQA at the front.
Okay. I want them to note it. I wanted to give them a little flexibility. Staff.
Yeah, and we're only recommending.
And I just want to go on record as saying, I'm glad that you're here, that is in your area of expertise.
All right. So you'll find a way to note the CEQA properly in that?
Yes, we'll follow
Okay.
the requirements.
All right. All right,
Yes.
when it's presented there, and make the determination. And with that undertaking, are you also in favor?
Yes.
Okay. And then I think we're approved. Thank you. Good work on this. We
Thank
look
you very much.
forward to more installments of this
Thank you.
work plan.
And I should have mentioned, too, I wanted to mention that my colleagues, Lena Perkins and Shiva Swaminathan, did an incredible amount of work on this as well, so I wanted to acknowledge them, too.
All right. Thank you, folks. So let's move on to agenda item number 2, discussion of results of residential survey, the adoption of distributed energy resources.
Yeah, why don't I move down here? Yes. Commissioners, I'd like to introduce Christine Tam, Senior Resource Planner, who will kick off the presentation.
What's it? I drive a horse trailer, so I can't do that. You need to put your microphone on.
Turn it on.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Christine Tam, and this evening I'll be presenting the results of the Residential Distributed Energy Resources Technology Survey along with Miranda Everett. So, yeah, what's going on? Page down.
Why don't you, here, notes first.
Okay. Some technical difficulties. Okay, sorry. So I wanted to refresh your memory of this DER plan that was presented by my colleague Shiva Swaminathan from November 2017. This was presented to the UAC, the DER plan, and there are 5 objectives in the draft DER plan presented last year. And out of the 5 objectives, one of them is to understand the community's adoption potential for different DER technologies and the diverse needs of this community to develop EE programs accordingly. So to meet that objective, staff decided to undertake a residential customer survey with the following objectives. The first one is to assess our residential customers' attitude towards home energy management. The second is to evaluate our residential customers' interests in a number of key DR technologies, including electric vehicles, rooftop photovoltaic systems, battery storage or community solar systems, as well as heat pump water heaters. And the third objective is to understand what are the customer barriers in adopting these types of DER technologies. The hope of this survey is to reach across the different customer segments to understand what motivates them to adopt DER technologies and what bars them from adopting DER technologies. We hired FM3, a public opinion research company, to help us with designing the survey, proposing a sampling methodology, and conducting the survey as well as tabulating the results. And actually, I also want to acknowledge Commissioner Schwartz and Commissioner Siegel in their very thoughtful input to coming up with the survey questionnaire. It's a rather long and lengthy process because we were originally trying to be very ambitious in the scope of this survey, but we realized that if we want to conduct a survey and keep the customer interested in staying on the phone, we need to limit the survey to 15 minutes. So we have to be very focused on the type of questions that we ask of our customers. So with that, I am going to turn to Miranda Everett from FM3, and she's going to talk about some of the top results from the survey.
So I just also want to mention to the commission that this survey is meant as we're presenting this survey sort of to lay groundwork for November's discussion of the Distributed Energy Resources Plan. So this will provide some background on some level of customer opinions that can be used to inform that plan. So you have some opportunity for discussion tonight. To the extent there's more discussion that you want to have, some of that can be held during the November meeting with the DER plan once you've had some time to absorb the full survey as well. So just wanted to make sure you knew you had that option as well.
All right. My name is Miranda Everett, as I've been introduced. I'm from Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen, Metz & Associates. We go by FM3 Research. It's much shorter. And I'm here to present results of this survey. There we go. So our research approach, in this instance, we were targeting 600 interviews, and we invited folks, customers of CPAU, to take the survey both online and also offered the option of taking it over the phone. So we were able to speak to more than that 600, 410 online, 303 on the phone. And this was conducted at the end of the month, starting June 27th and running through July 10th, with a break, of course, for the holiday. Results were weighted to reflect the distribution of the facts we know about the consumers already, so size of their residence, energy usage, when their home was built. And we also looked at some of the demographic information we had about the folks who responded to the survey. We compared that to census results. We also looked at voter surveys. Our firm has worked for the city of Palo Alto on many voter surveys in the last several years, just to get a sense of how they line up. And while it's not 100% apples to apples, because bill-paying customers might differ from all adults, some folks are 19 and don't pay any utility bill, and voters also differ. We felt they were mostly in line, and so we had this comparison on the slide. So we'll start with some baseline attitudes about energy management held by customers of CPAU. So one of the first questions we asked folks was whether they had already adopted certain technologies. And here we have a mix of kind of smart technologies and other ones, like different types of air conditioners. None of the above was also an option, of course. And what we see is that many customers have already started to adopt some of these kind of energy management devices. 31% have at least one of the smart gadgets. It doesn't add up there because some folks might have a Nest and a power strip. So we're just looking at the folks who say at least one of those. And 57% have at least one of these technologies. So they have either a smart gadget or some kind of air conditioner.
How is an air conditioner smart?
It's not. So the first three are the smart gadget, 31%. 57% is anyone with one of those listed.
I guess
we just asked in the same question. Here's a list of potential technologies, so there's no implication that it's a smart.
Okay, so you just referred to that as home energy management system. So you're saying air conditioning is a home energy management system.
The smart thermostat regulates the on-off the usage of these air conditioning systems.
I think what's happening here is, so we just had a list of appliances. So some of them are home energy management systems, and some are the air conditioner, because that was also kind of a proxy for using more energy. And we just had a yes, no, and so they're shown together on the slide. We could split them out and not imply that an air conditioner is a smart gadget, because it's not. I think that's right, but we're just showing who said yes to any of these things, if that makes sense. Okay. Sorry about that. So we also asked folks to tell us and give us a ranking of the three kinds of goals they have in mind for their decisions about appliances and utility uses. Which are their top two? And we asked for their first and their second preference here. And we saw that for most folks, saving money on their bill, 38% was their first priority. Another 36% called that their second priority. So for strong majority, that was at least one of their top two priorities. Just behind that is their comfort and convenience. And then 52% rank reducing my carbon footprint either first or second priority of the three listed. And I think this is relatively in line with what we see in other types of communities where we've asked similar questions and nationwide. Comfort and convenience and bill amount are really paramount. Concern for carbon footprint is kind of a third tier item, but the fact that more than half ranked it at least as a second choice, and some even as a first choice, is a interesting finding here. So we also asked folks to agree or disagree with some of these statements here, and it's kind of a mix of different kind of statements with sort of a positive valence and with a negative valence, but just trying to get at some of their baseline assumptions and attitudes about energy management and carbon footprint and things like that. We saw that 70% say that they already try to reduce their energy use at all times of the day. 66% say they would shift their energy use to reduce their carbon footprint. If it saved them money on their utility bill, they say, they would do it as well. Very similar results there. Whether you say carbon footprint or whether you say to reduce money on energy bill, there's still 2/3 who say they agree they would shift their energy use. We also had some statements that had that kind of negative valence, so I would not shift my energy use if it reduced my comfort and convenience. 37% disagreed with that statement, 28% agreed. The rest gave kind of a neutral opinion there. And then we also offered, with my busy schedule, I'm not sure I can make these kinds of adjustments. 47% say they disagree with that statement. So then diving into some of the specific technologies, we start with electric vehicles. So this question, we asked folks to tell us, do you currently own or lease an electric vehicle? 15% said yes, they do. We saw that in that pink box on the side there that homeowners are much more likely to say they own an electric vehicle than renters. Folks in a single family home, whether they're owners or renters, either way, are much more likely as well. Folks who have other kinds of technologies like solar are more likely to have adopted this as well.
And that includes EVs and plug-in hybrids? And how you asked the question?
Do you currently own or lease an electric vehicle is how we asked it, and however they interpreted that.
Okay.
Yeah. So of those folks who said that they own or lease one, we asked them follow-up questions about their motivations. And here is a list of reasons we offered for owning or leasing an EV. We said it could be a major reason, a minor reason, or not a reason would be in yellow there. It is better for the environment is by far a top rationale for these folks. Right behind it is the convenience of doing less maintenance and not refilling a gas tank. And then things like it's a better driving experience, the carpool lane, I just like trying new technologies. Those are also big reasons for folks, but far behind just the baseline kind of concern about the environment.
What does the yellow mean?
I'm sorry?
What does yellow mean there?
Not a reason. Yeah, that got cut off there in the formatting. Sorry about that. So again, of EV owners, we asked them where they usually charge their electric vehicle, and overwhelmingly folks said they do it at home, 72%. Behind that, 16% said they do it at work. And we saw, again, a similar pattern. Those folks with single-family detached homes or homeowners, they're much more likely to be folks who charge at home, and I think that makes sense given what we know about how the technology is implemented currently.
When you say it makes sense because of how the technology is implemented, what do you mean, chargers?
Yeah, from what I understand, it's much more common or easy to kind of, like I, for example, live in an apartment building with 20 units, and there's no kind of external place where I could charge anything. So.
And there aren't that many smart, fast charging situations, and not all EVs can take advantage of fast charging, so it's just from a time standpoint. That's also why the technology, the state that it's in, is more likely to do it where you leave your car for a long time.
So this might imply if we wanted to increase EV penetration to help provide electrification solutions to apartment buildings, multifamily buildings.
Yeah, I think that was something we identified in the survey as a barrier for those folks.
Yeah.
A clear one, yeah.
And I would say it's a validation of actually a program that we launched over a year ago to use low carbon fuel standard money to assist with multifamily charger installation.
So on that same note, we have folks who charge their electric vehicles at home, and this was an even slightly smaller group than just the EV owners. What type of outlet they use. The plurality, 43%, use just a kind of a standard 110 volt wall outlet to do so. 39% are using a level 2 charger with a 240 volt. And then just 16% are using a smart charger of that voltage. So we're seeing folks who are adopting this technology and then just kind of plugging it into the wall as is. So we also asked the folks who have an EV if they're likely to have a second, and we didn't specify, but they could assume that means to replace the one that they have in the future, or to, buy a second car, replace a different car that is not an EV. Whatever it means, it's an indication of, satisfaction with the current technology. And we saw that these folks are really satisfied with what they've got, 70%, or at least somewhat likely to purchase a second EV. And we also, in this case, put that time horizon of 3 years on it. So 49% very likely, 70% very or somewhat likely, and then a quarter say they're not likely. And then we also asked the folks who currently do not have an electric vehicle, and that was the majority of respondents here, so 609 of our 700 so respondents were asked this question. 37% are at least somewhat likely to purchase an EV in the next 3 years, 61% are not likely, and 32% say they're not at all likely. The next slide gets into some of the reasons why. So among those who don't own an EV and are also in that unlikely category, we gave them a list of potential reasons that would be the case. The top one, 60%, said a major reason for doing so, 59%, is that they just won't need a new car in the next 3 years. As mentioned earlier, the fleet turnover is relatively slow just on the natural, and so lots of folks are saying there's no kind of specific barrier except that they just don't need one. Behind that, we've got, I'm worried about the limited drive distance between chargings. 69% say that's at least a minor reason for them. 39% say that's a major one. An electric vehicle is too expensive, similar levels of agreement there. And then I don't have access to an electric two-way charging station at home. 1/3 call that a major reason, and 58% call that at least a minor reason. And then kind of a potpourri of other reasons that are just much less intensely shared here, and that's just preferring other modes of transportation that are not vehicles at all, or private vehicles at all. Worry about increasing their home electric bill, or the concern about needing a larger vehicle. That's something we see a lot in maybe more rural and suburban areas, but in urban areas we don't see that as often. So we looked at the reasons to not consider an EV in the next 3 years among those folks and split it out by folks who own a single-family home and then everybody else. And among one of the strongest differences we saw is highlighted there. I don't have access to a charging station at home. 2/3 of the folks who don't own their own single-family home said that that was a major or minor reason for them, compared with half of the single-family homeowners. So a 15-point difference there, and kind of underscores that barrier for those folks.
Did you do any kind of crosstab to see if the biking, public transit, ride-hailing apps sort of broke out differently age-wise? Was this a generational thing?
I can look at that. It might take a minute, but I've got a big book full of answers for that. You can jot that down. I'll look it up. Thank you. So then we asked another kind of way to get at this among those who don't own an EV and are unlikely to purchase soon. What could we do? What could we help you with to get you there? And here was just a list of things they could check any that they, or tell the interviewer that they were interested in, that would make them more likely to purchase or lease an EV. A rebate, 44% said they would like that. 32% said they would like more public or at-work charging stations. Special rates for EV charging, 32%. And assistance installing the equipment at home, 30%. So for folks, there's lots of different things, approaches that could work. Some of them have to do with money, and some of them just have to do with kind of convenience and technological barriers. So the next kind of category of technologies we looked at was rooftop solar, battery storage, and community solar. So 7% of respondents reported having rooftop solar at home. Most of those said that renewable energy sources, wanting to have a renewable energy source, the fact that solar is one, is a key reason to go solar. And saving money on a utility bill was also important to those folks. 93% called it a major or minor reason that solar is renewable. So again, that kind of underscores the earlier sense that folks in this community are pretty conscious about their carbon footprint and the environment. But also about their utility bills. 76% say that's a major reason to have rooftop solar. 89% called at least a minor reason. Kind of the more abstract value statement, the solar.
Excuse me. So you gave the rooftop solar saves money on my bills. It's not true in Palo Alto necessarily. or neutral at best, right? How was the question presented? Is that just their assumption that it saves money?
Yeah, so that was offered. They could say major reason, minor reason, not a reason. If they thought it wasn't a reason, 11% said so. So it's either a perception they have that may be incorrect, or it may be true in their case.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're measuring perceptions, and sometimes we know those differ from, folks may not have the ability to shop around or know what the case would be that they're not living in.
So one of the things that's coming up now that to put as a note for if you do a follow-on to this in the future is energy independence and feeling like your energy is actually turning out to get a whole new demographic involved in this. So just put that as a note to add to any future surveys to see if that's there.
It's a great note.
Can I ask a question on this slide as well?
Yes.
Solar tied to energy storage can provide an emergency power supply. It might be as much an engineering question as anything. Because I know that if the grid goes down, solar systems cease to work if they're grid tied, even with Rule 24 and the new inverter something. If the grid is down, your solar system is down, right? So does it recharge your home energy storage system? Like, can you survive for several days and your solar system will continue to charge your power wall on a daily cycle?
Depends which one you get. Not all of them can.
Right, so it depends, you have to disconnect Shiva Swaminathan, City of Palo Utilities. Yes, you have to have a transfer switch which it disconnects from the grid, and then you can be self-sufficient.
There was a new product that I saw at Solar Power International, that if that's what you wanted to do, if you wanted to be able to island and keep running with your solar, that this could do it, but it's it's a different,
So it's possible,
not a power wall.
a customer for whom this is an important feature could configure their system that way. Is it safe to say that the respondents who have rooftop solar at home are unlikely to have the configuration? And so this perception of it being an emergency power, solar and storage being an emergency power supply is a misguided perception. Because it's what's actually providing the emergency power supply is just the storage unit, and it could have been, there could be no solar involved and they would have the same level of emergency backup.
Yes, possibly either a misguided perception or a plan for the future.
Sure. Well, this is those who reported having rooftop solar at home, but.
Right, in many cases we find with these kinds of statements, it might not be something they've considered, but they see it and they think, oh, that's great, I didn't know, and go on with their lives. So it may be something that, again, is not something.
So maybe that's a note also for future follow-ups, is not spread misinformation in the way that the questions are constructed.
So we also asked folks who do not have rooftop solar, who told us they don't have it. We gave them a list of reasons that would be the case. Here we've got don't know is also called out here in green. We didn't do that in earlier ones. This one just because there's a little bit higher levels of folks who are missing some information, which makes sense. If you don't have a technology, you may not have looked into it as thoroughly. I don't have access to my roof to install solar. 40% call that a major reason that they don't currently have it. 43 call it a major or a minor reason. It's interesting here that folks either pretty much call it a major reason or not a reason at all. It's kind of one of the big barriers for folks. Solar economics don't pan out for my house, ranks behind that. It's well behind it though. Don't have time to look into it. My roof is specifically not suitable for it, reducing carbon in other ways. And at the bottom, my electricity supply is already carbon neutral. Those are things that folks who don't have rooftop solar are telling us are really not barriers for them. It really comes down to not having access to their roof. So living in a rental, living in a condo, living somewhere where you think or you know that you can't install it yourself. So of those folks who told us they don't have it now, we asked them if they're thinking about installing it in that next 3-year window. 8% said yes, 12% said they don't know, so they're kind of in the middle there, and 80% said no, they're not. We also asked about energy storage. 6% say they either have it now or are considering buying it the next, installing it in the next 3 years. And we looked at some of the subgroups there. So earlier we had asked folks if they own an electric vehicle or if they have PV. And the folks who have those technologies already are more interested in storage, which I think makes sense. It's kind of related to that technology, and it also just shows a kind of orientation toward interest in these kinds of technologies. But again, it's about 1 in 5 or so. So not an incredible amount of interest in this, but much, much higher among those folks who've adopted other kinds of technologies. So we also gave folks either on the phone they heard it or online they read it, this description of community solar. And our next question for them was, does this sound like something you would be extremely interested in, very, somewhat, or not too interested in?
So the thing about community solar participants would have the opportunity to meet up to 100% of their electricity needs with locally generated solar electricity. Okay, why did we put that in there? Why would we put in something that is impossible? Like this is the part that kind of makes me crazy, because it reinforces this fantasy that, and I know CCAs do it, okay? And when you say to someone, well, they can't possibly offer you 100% of your electricity from solar, they say, well, why do they say it to me? Okay, so I just want to say that if we ever do this again, or ever do this, I just don't want us saying these made-up statements that I understand are popular, but are just not true. It can't be, unless they're only using electricity between 10 in the morning and 6 at night, or whatever, 5 at 5, they can't have it. So I just don't understand why we even put that in there.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's a comment. We'll take it to heart next time we run a survey like this.
So given that paragraph, a slim majority, 53%, say they're extremely or very interested in it. 43% say they are somewhat or not too interested in it. Just 13% say they're not too interested in it, kind of the lowest on the scale we gave them. We looked at some demographic subgroups here. Owners and renters, not too different. 54% among owners, 51% among renters, and that's the extremely and very combined, that percentage there. Single-family homeowners, 55% interest. Condo and townhome, 53%. Apartments a little bit lower at 45%. And then homes that already have solar, people who have PV, 41% say they're extremely or very interested in this, and non-PV were 53%. So higher among those groups, but getting into the subsamples, the margins of error get larger there. So to put kind of a finer point on it, we also asked the total additional cost per month that they would be willing to pay in a world where this were possible.
Yeah, thank you for including that question. You don't have to read the numbers here. We can read those. I think that's a good way to ask the question. Remind us, what's the average electric bill per household in Palo Alto?
I should be able to spin that off the top of my head at this point. Unfortunately, it's been a long day, and I'll have to get back to you on that.
It's not a test. It's not a test.
Candor's appreciated.
And was there any connection? You know, it's nice that somebody would say, I'd pay $5 extra for community solar. but that really isn't a number that is what it costs to have community solar. So again, if you're going to use a number of whether somebody would want to have community solar, wouldn't it be useful to use a number that would actually be reflective of what it would, so 90% said they'd like it for $5. They'd probably like a Tesla for $20,000 too. Everybody would buy a Tesla if it was 20 grand. So I think that, again, if you're going to do something like this and you're going to use a number, then you should go look at it and say, here are community solar programs, and this is what it costs to pay a subscription for doing those.
Yeah, I found it interesting that half the people said they'd pay $20 more a month, which surprised me. My suspicion, though, is that it would be about doubling your home electric charge. For most people, it would be more than $20 a month. So I really don't want this, first, the prior slide being cited as 53% being very interested, because I think when we factor in the economics, it'll be a much smaller percentage.
Home electricity bills in the ballpark of $70 to $80 per month.
Okay.
Average.
So if people were getting unsubsidized community solar, it'd be an extra $70 a month.
We don't know. I mean, it depends what the installation is.
Yeah.
So we did the economics. It's possible to provide incremental. So what John said was the average bill, incrementally for $10. We did some economic analysis, and we would be able to provide it at about that price, addition to the $70.
I think it might be the topic for if we come back and talk with you about community solar. We need to get, the economics are complicated. We need to get into we need to have a clear presentation. It's tough to sum it up in a single number.
Thank you.
But
tonight.
Before we leave the topic of community solar, I'm scratching my head at the result that 41% of PV households are extremely or very interested in participating in community solar. And I don't know if, I didn't see any follow-up questions that would help tease apart on that result. It makes me wonder if they understood that the program is intended to meet your own electricity needs.
The thing is, the people
It just speaks to perhaps confusion about what is this paragraph describing.
I think what true this and they're going to get a net on their bill per se. They're doing it because they really believe this is a positive thing to do. So, green altruists who want to do anything they can to animate and support the market.
I think that's evident from the other answers that we have a lot of those people in Palo. I think these slides about community solar also interrelate with the next slide you have about people's awareness of our existing.
Actually, I wanted to get back to the question, the issue that raised by Commissioner Forcell. So of the 7% of the survey respondents who said yes, that they have rooftop solar, I think some of them might have misunderstood the question of rooftop photovoltaic versus rooftop solar thermal system, because when we went back and checked their the number of respondents who have the NAM rate on their bill, only 3.6% of the respondents have NAM rates. So I think a lot of them may not actually have solar photovoltaic PV system. Yeah.
That sounds like a potentially plausible explanation. Thanks.
Yeah, just generally, you're talking to folks online, they're taking a survey, or you're talking to them for 15 minutes. It may not be something they've ever thought about before, and you're asking them, a lot of very detailed questions that we know the ins and outs of, or lots of folks in this room, maybe more so than me even. And so when you ask people about different perceptions and ideas they have, it's not always exactly the truth, and it's not always exactly correct because they're operating on that assumption. And I think the point about just folks being carbon conscious and environmentally conscious and thinking, I'm all in and whatever it takes, that they're not thinking about the solar panel on the roof and this being redundant. They're thinking, yeah, solar's great, I want more of it. And that's kind of the frame they're putting on that in their busy lives. So the next question we asked folks was another kind of knowledge question. We asked people, from what you know, what percentage of electricity supplied by City of Palo Alto utilities is carbon neutral, that is, produces zero net carbon emissions? And 11% gave their correct answer.
So I did not understand this question the way it's worded. I have no idea what you were asking people. It completely confused me. I have no idea what the question is to know what 11% are saying correctly.
They said 100.
Well, no, but the thing is, again, carbon neutral is not the same thing as 100% renewable or zero carbon.
Right, so again, we're asking them to tell us the answer to a question that they might not fully understand, and that is part of what this tells us is that folks are not aware about the 100% figure, and part of it is telling us that maybe the phrase carbon neutral or net zero emissions, maybe that doesn't mean enough to them to understand. So I think you're highlighting a point that I think is clear here, that regardless of, right, that the...
Right, so I agree that I know that people are confused, but so 3 in 5 customers believe that less than 21% of electricity supplied by City of Palo Alto is carbon neutral. Oh, so what you were, I guess this is, I'm having a wording question of how it was worded. It's if I, who spend a lot of time thinking about this, can't understand the question, I guarantee you that somebody who spends 10 minutes a year thinking about it doesn't understand the question. And so I agree with you that I think it's reasonable to draw a conclusion that people don't know what carbon neutral means, but I'm just saying I don't think this question was properly worded to be able to.
I think it's a fair takeaway that people probably, many of our users probably don't have a good understanding of our mix of electricity sources.
What the phrase means.
What the phrase means, but people who are less into it may understand the question at a different level, and this at least says they don't really know how our electricity is provided by where our input sources.
I agree. So the campaign that the utilities has been promoting since 2013 is the carbon neutral electric supply. So I think this question is pointing to is that a lot of our customers don't understand that brand that we've been putting out, that promotion message that we're putting out. So definitely something for.
And if we educate
staff
everybody, their usage might go up. So I don't know if that.
So we also looked at the figure, the folks who answered correctly, so got 100, and kind of the crosstabs there. So those who plan to install a PV system within the next 3 years, no different than those overall, 12% got that right. Those extremely or very interested in community solar, 54% got that right. Is that right? Sorry. And then cites carbon neutral electric supply as a reason not to install rooftop PV. That's a relatively small subgroup, but among those folks, so 32% answered that question correctly. And let me check that middle figure real quick.
One of the things I found really interesting about this survey, and it's not necessarily embodied here it's embodied in the crosstabs, is that the reasons that people cite, if they understand that we have 100% carbon neutral electricity, they don't cite solar as a renewable resource as a reason for installing solar, but they still want to install solar. They're more likely to want to pair solar with storage. So there's some interesting takeaways just from asking those two questions together about people's motivations for solar plus storage, or solar in Palo Alto, depending on their level of knowledge.
And on that middle one that I said I would look into, so that one just, like the one above it, resembles customers overall. So the one that really stands out is the folks who say carbon neutral electric supply is a reason not to install rooftop PV. Those ones were a little bit more aware of the 100% figure, but otherwise they don't differ too much. So the next type of technology we looked at was heat pump water heaters. So we asked folks, what type of water heater do you have at home? Again, this is them, wherever they're taking or answering the survey, trying to think in their heads, do they know the answer to this? 16% don't. That might be more renters or multi-unit homes. I know I don't know the answer for myself. But gas tank heaters are very common. 69% say they have that. 75% have some kind that is powered by gas. And 8% have something that's electric-based. 2% have electric tankless water heaters, so at least know enough to tell us that they do. Most folks have it in their garage or utility closet. Some have it in their basement, and some folks just don't know. So we also asked folks, how familiar are they with heat pump water heaters? And we gave them the brief bit of context that these are ultra-efficient electric water heaters. 26% said they're very or somewhat familiar with this. 71% said they're not familiar, and 51% said they're not at all familiar with this technology. We haven't asked this question in too many other places, but I believe it's probably when we put in a list of kinds of utility technologies, appliances, things like that, it is near the bottom of the list in familiarity. It's relatively new to folks. So we also asked, would you be interested in switching from a gas water heater to a heat pump?
I'm going to ask, since we're running way behind schedule,
Okay.
that you just point out key things, because we can read the numbers here pretty well.
Okay. So 1/3 of those are interested in switching to one like this. All right. That one there.
Can I go back to the heat pump water heaters? You call them, what did you call them? Ultra efficient? Maybe it's, ultra efficient. And I'm just curious where that language came from and whether you think if you just, I don't know, it just sounds very markety to me in a survey question. And if no one knows what it is, I don't know how much that impacts their answer, as opposed to just an electric water heater, heat pump water heater. Because now you're making a distinction in the kind of electric water heater.
I think the challenge that we always wrestle with in these questions is how much explanation to give when people are unfamiliar with the term heat pump water heater. But I think the counter concern that we have is exactly what you're talking about, whether we end up skewing the questions.
Right, you're introducing
and so
bias.
I think we made a call. I think we can take the comment as we can take the comment and note it for future surveys.
So if you made it as a comparison, if you had an ultra-efficient gas water heater versus an ultra-efficient electric heater, that would be the point of comparison. But by saying this one is you're introducing bias that suggests that this is a more efficient water heater than the other one.
Yeah, and when the question is familiarity, I think there is bias regardless, but whether it's familiar or interest, I think interest to be a much a fundamental concern with the question. But
All right, I'm going to jump in here to move us along. Slide 35, price is the biggest barrier. Slide 36, EV and PV owners are the likeliest early adopters. And key takeaways, we can see those. EV, it's about charging. Access and drive range. PV, it may be about access to the roof, you're a renter, or you don't have a suitable roof. And the heat pump water heater, it's about cost and reviews, maybe knowledge base on that. I don't think we need to go look at the following slide. I think there are a lot of interesting results from this, including the fact that we already knew that a lot of people in Palo Alto want to do the right thing, even if they may not be aware exactly what that is. A lot of people may not be aware of how our electric supply is composed. And we're going to have a lot more electric cars coming based on all those people who want to buy a second one already, the rate of adoption there. Jonathan, from the department's point of view, are there any other key takeaways that you would highlight out of this?
I'd say you've given a really good initial summary, and if we have any others that we really want to highlight, we can talk about them at the November meeting.
All right. So we were hard on you about some of the questions. It's hard to get them in a way that people understand and get useful stuff. There was a lot of interesting results from this. So apologize about you off at the end here. We've got several more agenda items, and don't want to keep people too late.
I just want to add
Yeah, please.
one highlight, especially when we're talking about this aspirational goal of 90% electric vehicles, that there's this, opportunity with renters or multi-unit dwellings, where if we want to get to 90%, we're going to have to fix that gap there too.
Just one.
Sources.
And one comment, I mean, as the chair said, the takeaway that I got from the survey is we have a lot of people in Palo Alto who want to do the right thing. I think the fact that a higher percentage don't realize that we have, maybe not precisely carbon neutral, but largely carbon neutral electricity, is really important for people to get that message, not only because I think they will like that, but also that drives some of these decisions, wanting to be on carbon neutral electricity. They already are, and I think people need to understand that when they make some of these decisions that we're asking them about.
But if you look at the plurality of opinion, the other takeaway that I think we need to, is that the people who are the really focused green people are a relatively small percentage. And they're the ones who are the most vocal when it comes time to the climate action plan and doing other things. And that we can't assume that those people represent the bulk of the customers in the community. And so to me, that's part of what the survey showed, is that not everybody is really gung-ho. The ones who are really gung-ho. And so I think we have to just be careful about that.
One, I would note that as really a moral of the story, that part of a primary reason we undertook this survey, which was focused on a random response rather than the survey of the self-selected, which would typically be your Survey Monkey type response, was to get at how much of what is often discussed here, and again, very passionately discussed here by certain community members, is scalable, and recognizing the level of awareness and level of interest from our customer base as a whole. And I think this gives us some really important insights on that point. And again, we'll come back with that next month.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, folks.
All right, so with that, we should turn to recycled water.
All right.
Okay, commissioners, if you'll remember back in August, we spoke to you about the Phase 3 plan, which was of extending recycled water irrigation to the largely the Stanford Research Park. This is that whole business plan.
Oh, Carly? Sorry, you missed AC. Yeah.
I just want to say, this is one of, you got this.
Sam's. I want to introduce Ellie as facilities lead, a senior resource planner on this whole project, and she'll give you all the context. We also have, you want to go by Sam or Samantha? Okay, so we have Sam Engelage from our Public Works Department, deep expert on recycled water, as well as, do we still have Phil? Oh. Phil Bobel, Assistant Director with our Public Works Department, also, long history with Palo Alto, deeply committed to environmental sustainability and recycled water, as well as our consultants, Randy Rain from RMC, Randy Rains and Carrie Del Boccio. So thanks to everybody who's here, and also who couldn't be here, Karin North, who also worked on the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Carla Daly, Senior Resource Planner. And for members of the public, we did leave, this is a reference sheet that we like to call our placemat, and I'm considering laminating mine personally. It's a really great resource. And It was attached to the packet, so anybody who looked at the packet saw it, but this is a nice big color copy of it. So there's a few extras in the back for anyone else who would like one. As Jonathan pointed out, recycled water by its nature is a very collaborative issue. Obviously, the water's coming from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant, which is a public works asset, but any water that we might potentially use in our portfolio certainly impacts the utilities side of what's going on here in the city. So in addition to all the folks that Jonathan mentioned, the Santa Clara Valley Water District is also involved in this project, and I'll talk a little bit more about them as we get into the presentation, which I know we're running a little bit behind, so we'll keep it moving. Uh-oh, where's my, oh, there it is. Quickly, here's the agenda. So over the next, well, beginning in August, we came to you to talk to you a bit about the Phase 3 pipeline, which is the project to move recycled water through an extension of the distribution system up mainly to the Stanford Research Park. Tonight, we're coming back to you to talk to you about some of the other alternatives for that water and get some kind of gut reactions from you and some feedback on some of the high-level concepts that we're looking at. But over the next months and into the next year, we're going to be coming to you a lot to talk to you about recycled water, both the UAC and the council. And so a lot of what we're hoping to do tonight is not only get those kind of emotional reactions from you on some of these ideas, but get us all on the same page with respect to the language that we use around recycled water, because there's lots of terms that get thrown around that we all need to kind of all understand to get into the more nitty-gritty detail on these projects that you'll be seeing beyond tonight. So again, the reference sheet is hopefully going to be a good resource to help us all get there, but just keep that in mind as sort of one of our goals tonight. So as I said, we want to inform the UAC on these high-level concepts on water reuse opportunities, kind of get this feeling for community acceptance for some of the potential projects, gauge the importance of cost versus all of these other non-cost attributes that we can use to evaluate our project alternatives, and gather some feedback from you on this idea of how important it is to keep that water here in Palo Alto for potential future use versus maybe more quickly monetizing it and moving it out of the county. So just a couple of quick notes about Palo Alto's water supply, and I don't think this is anything new to any of you, but we do get 100% of our potable supplies from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission regional water system. 85% of that comes from the Tuolumne River and about 15% from local reservoirs. So you may be aware that in August, the City Council took action to support the Bay Delta Plan, which is a could potentially be a state mandated decision, but hopefully more likely actually be a settlement. But however the Bay Delta Plan turns out, it's almost certainly going to mean less water for the regional water system, particularly in times of drought. So to the extent that we can expand recycled water use here in Palo Alto, I think it's fair to say that that alleviates some pressure on the Tuolumne River, particularly in times of low precipitation. We do use recycled water here in the city today at some city facilities, namely Greer Park, the golf course, a couple of smaller facilities. We also have 8 wells, but we don't use those on an ongoing basis. Those are there for emergencies, and we don't really consider drought emergency. It's more drastic earthquake, pipelines are broken, we need to get water to people. That's why they were developed, fire suppression, that sort of thing. There's, on the water supply planning side, the kind of overarching document is this Water Integrated Resources Plan, where we develop both short and long-term water, potable water and non-potable water portfolio alternatives. So in the Water Integrated Resources Plan, we look at a whole bunch of different potential water supplies, and I just wanted to point out that the three that are in bold are the ones that we're going to be talking about tonight. So there are all kinds of other potential water supplies, gray water, that sort of thing, stormwater, but that's not what we're going to be speaking about tonight. We're just talking about the water from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant. And again, once we kind of figured out what our ideal portfolio will look like, we need to evaluate those alternatives against the idea of moving the water out of the county to probably the south part of the county that is a little more thirsty than we are up here. Also, as a reminder, there is a water section of the SCAP, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's a bunch of stuff in there about reducing our need in imported water and developing local drought-proof supplies. This is another chart I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but it's there are a lot of different plans and projects around recycled water going on in parallel, and it can get kind of confusing when we start talking about one versus another. And this also shows the overlap between the work that we're doing here in Palo Alto and the work that the district is doing and the work that we're doing together. So this Northwest County Recycled Water Strategic Plan, which is the bubble in the middle, is a joint project between Palo Alto and all of the partners who contribute wastewater to the regional plant and the district. The district, in fact, is paying for 90% of this, so they are by far the major funder. You can kind of see the little bubble over here. That's the Phase 3 business plan that we brought to you in August, and this square over here is what we're talking about tonight, comparing recycled water alternatives against the Phase 3 alternative. The district also has their own countywide reuse master plan that is being developed as we speak, and up at the top here is the Water Integrated Resources Plan that we mentioned on the previous slide. I'm going to turn the rest of the presentation over to my colleague, Sam Englage. Hand the microphone.
Thanks. Thanks, Carla. So Sam Englage, Senior Engineer in our Public Works Department. So as Carla mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of the major objectives for this particular presentation tonight is to provide high-level information regarding the different water reuse opportunities for the city of Palo Alto that we're currently evaluating under the strategic plan, as well as in other regional projects that are currently going on. The overall goal is to provide high-level feedback to you, or information to you at this point, so you can give us high-level feedback that we would then incorporate into the strategic plan prior to finalization and bringing it back to you to comment on detailed implementation alternatives. So tonight we're going to focus very high level, but please know that each one of these water reuse opportunities that we're going to speak about tonight can be implemented in numerous different ways. And so each one of those implementation alternatives will be brought back to you for further consideration at future meetings. So the slide in front of you summarizes the different water reuse opportunities that we're going to touch on tonight. Also, please note that even though we're trying to dice it up and discuss it discretely, each one of these opportunities could potentially be implemented in parallel or in conjunction with each other, or in phased approaches.
Would it be possible, and just go back to that slide for a second, to have like a $, $2, $3 item that goes next to it to say, maybe direct potable reuse is a great idea, but that's a $4 item versus non-potable reuse would only be a $1 sign. Would that be something that could help us maybe understand the relative merits of cost?
Definitely. So at future dates, when we start to dive into the implementation alternatives of each one of these water reuse opportunities, we're going to dive into and present the costs associated with each one of them. Right now, the water reuse opportunities that we're discussing tonight appear comparable in cost. So cost has not been a fatal flaw in our evaluations to date. Except for the satellite, but we're not going to discuss satellite tonight. So all of the water reuse opportunities that we're discussing in the subsequent slides have been costed out and appear feasible.
And could I ask a similar question, which is, can we get some idea of how much potable water each of these options would save?
Yes, so we are going to get to that in subsequent slides, but if you want to have a quick peek, it's way down here at this slide here. So this slide is going to compare and give you an idea of the potential impact on our imported water dependence. Okay, back up to non-potable reuse. So this is the first water reuse opportunity that we're going to discuss tonight. This is probably the opportunity that you are most familiar with. Non-potable reuse involves enhanced recycled water that is then used for irrigation and commercial uses. This also includes toilet flushing and industrial process water uses. Some of the benefits to non-potable reuse include that we can implement it in the near term. And also there are very clear regulations surrounding how to exactly implement a non-potable reuse program.
Can you define near term?
Near term, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. We currently have a non-potable reuse program, but for the purposes of the strategic plan, non-potable reuse is meant to encapsulate enhanced recycled water, which is a higher quality recycled water than we currently produce at the regional plant. So some of the obstacles surrounding non-potable reuse include the fact that it is limited in how you can use that recycled water. Because it's only treated to enhanced recycled water standards, you can really only use it for irrigation and non-potable demands. So it's very limited in the potential impact in our other water portfolio supplies. The next water reuse opportunity that we're going to discuss is indirect potable reuse. So indirect potable reuse is recycled water that has been highly treated to purified standards. It's then introduced into an environmental buffer prior to connecting to the drinking water distribution system. So in this case, an environmental buffer would be our groundwater aquifer.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Can these two coexist? In other words, if the non-potable reuse is built out to Stanford Research Park, does that infect the groundwater aquifer with recycled water that has not gone through advanced water purification and therefore eliminates the possibility to do indirect potable reuse in the future?
No, they can be implemented at the same time. We do have one of our implementation alternatives evaluating that exact scenario where we do have a non-potable reuse program that provides it to Stanford Research Park, as well as an IPR program within the city.
I think your concern is with the recycled water, the non-potable water potentially contaminate, or your question, or
basically they're sort of our groundwater aquifer separated,
right?
Specifically rejecting so don't co-mingle.
Potable reuse, purified water, the recycled water would just be kind of percolating down into the soil to the upper aquifer.
So treat that recycled water to that high purified level. It's essentially equal to your other potable water supplies. So you would be able to shower with it, you can fill your swimming pools with it, you can drink it, all of those other uses that you are currently using from SFPUC water. It also has the potential to use a large amount of water from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant. So unlike non-potable reuse, where it's restricted really based on irrigation demands, indirect potable reuse has the potential to really make a large impact on how much water is reused within the city.
Just to make sure I understand, you just dump it into the aquifers and?
Correct. So once it's treated and purified, we would then inject it into the aquifer underneath Palo Alto, and then there's a travel time where it mixes with the groundwater that's currently there. And then we would extract it from our current groundwater wells that are currently used for emergencies only, and insert it into the potable system through that infrastructure.
So it might change the taste of the water.
It does require that we use groundwater as another source of potable water, yes.
And then how is it treated once you do the groundwater extraction?
So there is the ability for us to treat it for aesthetic properties such as taste or odor concerns. It does add to the cost of that implementation alternative, but it is possible.
Is the energy usage for the additional purification both before it goes in the ground, into the groundwater aquifer and after it comes up, as well as the pumping required and the energy required for the actual active injecting and pumping, is that significant?
I don't know the answer to that one. Carrie, do you know?
But we do have carbon neutral electricity here, so.
Yeah, Carrie Del Baccio with Woodard and Curran, one of the engineers working on the study with Sam and Carla. I don't know offhand the numbers of kilowatt hours compared to the other alternatives, but we do include all of those costs in what we're looking at in our study. So from
Let me just chime in.
Sure.
So we know that the cost, yours was a two-part thing. It was the cost of treating the water, and it was cost of pumping it down to the aquifer. We do have a pretty good fix on the treatment costs. It's a reverse osmosis process. It's very energy intensive. And so it is significant, no question about it. The pumping down, we're not sure of, and we'd have to get back to you on that.
All right, so one of the obstacles that we've identified for indirect potable reuse was briefly discussed just recently, but it is that we would have to increase the use of our groundwater in order to implement indirect potable reuse. The next water reuse opportunity is direct potable reuse. It's very similar to indirect potable reuse, except there's no environmental buffer between the treatment of the recycled water and the actual distribution system. And because of that, there's additional treatment steps that are needed to ensure and to apply a safety factor to the recycled water that is purified.
Let me just ask you a question on that. Is it okay from a regulatory standpoint to mix that with other water that we're getting, say, Hetch, and meet all of the water quality standards?
So the regulations around direct potable reuse are not fully developed, and that's one of the obstacles that would have to be overcome in order to implement this. Direct potable reuse, because of the regulatory uncertainty right now, is a long-term option. There's no way that we can really implement that in the next 5 years or so. Those would have to be worked out prior. But some of the go ahead, sorry.
Only if you're done answering his.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
Is the purification required for direct potable reuse at some higher standard than the purification required for injecting it into groundwater and then extracting it?
Correct. So Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit complicated because there are no actual regulations for direct potable reuse right now, so we don't actually know what the state is going to require. They've issued a report.
Turn to me if you need some help.
stating that they've made a determination of feasibility that direct potable reuse projects are feasible for the state of California, and they've provided example treatment trains within those. Typically what they're doing is requiring more redundant steps. So if you already have one kind of disinfection process, they're going to require a second disinfection process so that you have a backup in case something fails. But there is no prescriptive treatment train yet. We do assume, though, that would be more than what you have to do under the existing regulations for the groundwater recharge projects.
So similar to indirect potable reuse, direct potable reuse does have the opportunity to use a lot of the water from the regional water quality control plant and to provide that as an additional potable supply source. Some of the obstacles we've already touched on, mainly that the regulations are not fully developed and that public acceptance is something that we would like to get more feedback on tonight, actually.
Can I ask you, because I'm a little confused, why is wouldn't public acceptance be an obstacle for both?
Correct.
Or what is it that by pumping it first into the groundwater changes that?
So it's a concern for both both indirect potable reuse and direct potable reuse opportunities. The perception is that for direct potable use, it may be more of a concern because the regulations aren't fully developed. Nobody has really done direct potable use before in the United States. And the concept of, I kind of hate to say this, but toilet to tap often is brought up and can really paint a bad picture for direct potable reuse.
But they both are. I mean, one has an intermediary step, but it's the same starting water and it's ending in the same place, right?
Correct, but direct potable reuse is currently being done in Southern California. So there are references for people to look up and Google, and there's that environmental buffer that is there that is a lot easier for people to accept than a direct flange-to-flange connection.
Yeah, and I think that psychologically,
Right.
the idea, and it depends how much of it you actually ask people to drink, because now it's just like when we have an occasional emergency situation, you get the water, it tastes different, but the idea that it's going through the aquifer, I think, and you're replenishing the aquifer, I think has a positive feeling for people, just like people get so upset when people pump out for the basements. So I think the idea that you're putting water back in psychologically would be positive, but the idea that toilet to tap, I think, is, and the fact that it doesn't exist anywhere else, I think would be a heavy lift.
Let me just add that Sam used the word buffer, so it's in two ways a buffer. One is just the distance from one well to the drinking well. That's just kind of a distance thing. But we know from many studies that have been done that there is real pollutant removal and biological, bacterial, virus removal from the soil itself. So moving through the soil is a very real treatment step, if you will.
Can I ask another question about reverse osmosis?
Sure.
I know vanishingly little about reverse osmosis, so I'm hoping you can set me straight. I'm under the impression that for every sort of like gallon of treated water, there's multiple gallons of water that were part of the process but don't come out as clean. Can you shed some light on whether I'm completely mistaken or that's part of how it works?
I think you are on the right track. So reverse osmosis, there is, for every 1 gallon that you feed the membrane, maybe 0.8 of it comes out as permeate or very, very purified water, and then you have about 0.2 of it that is very concentrated and not purified water that needs to be wasted or carried on to further treatment elsewhere. Was that your question?
Can I add one thing?
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, although I'm happy to hear a follow-up as well.
Just a clarifying point, so that's different from ocean desalination, where the ratio can more 1 gallon, 2 gallons in, 1 gallon of purified water out. It depends on the concentration of salt in the water. So the water from the wastewater treatment plant is less salty than the ocean, so you actually have a much more efficient RO process.
So I had it right that there's some leftover water, but it's a much less proportion than I thought.
So you might be thinking of
For our
ocean
scenario.
desal projects.
Okay.
So don't leave, because I thought Commissioner Forcell had asked a different question, which is how drinkable does reverse osmosis of sewage treated water meet drinking water standards?
So it does. It completely purifies the water, so much so that every now and
So
then.
the constraint is cost and energy, not the purity.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. So sometimes you will have to add minerals back into the water for aesthetics and taste concerns, and you do want to be careful about any potential leaching in the distribution system. But that's definitely getting into a lot of detail. So at this point, we did want to pause and get some feedback from the commission on the concepts of potable reuse, both indirect potable reuse and direct potable reuse. And I think we have a little bit of that. But if there's any other additional feedback at this point, we have two guiding questions up there for you to consider. One is, do you think the Palo Alto community is willing to accept more groundwater use or the use of groundwater routinely in their potable supply? The second guiding question is, do you think the Palo Alto community would accept direct potable reuse at this point or any point in the future? And if so, under what circumstances?
So this is one of those places that I would definitely do public outreach, okay? Because I think if you had the short-term thing of, hey, we can, do the purple pipe approach, and that's something we can do to 3 to 5 years, and here are these other ones. I think the idea of having some community meetings and letting people weigh in on this would be, so we could make our educated guess of what we think people would do, but I think it would be foolhardy to not let people weigh in. There would be absolutely, because this is going to be one of those emotional issues.
Correct.
And if people are going to freak out at the idea of toilet to tap and no one's doing it, why put yourselves through that, even if there's some, so I think that, and this is a good place to ask people's opinion and, I think it can be presented in a way that is straightforward enough and clear enough that people would get it, and you can have, if people are willing to taste it, and drink it and stuff like that, that tells you something. So I think this would be a really good public outreach opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, the interesting thing about it is it really is a long-term project. I mean, it's, and so it does get a little trickier, I think, to do public outreach when you're talking about something that could be 20 years down the road. And regardless of how we get that public input, you as policy guiders, makers, setters, it would be really interesting for us to hear your thoughts on this too.
And I think it could be a great project to do with the schools too. I think this could be a way to get kids involved and, that I think, you've talked about this before with other things. I think this would be, they could do science experiments. I used to be in the water business. So, we could do the thing where you do freezing. There are all kinds of science experiments that could go with it that I think could be very cool. So,
Terry, your light is on. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about the ability to change people's opinion. To be very self-serving here, when I took over what is now called Cal Recycle in 1979, public opinion polling said 2% of the public thought recycling ought to be part of their lives. When Jerry Brown left, because Governor Duke Mason thought recycling was idiotic, but when he left 3 years later, we had it at 83%. So I think education works. So that said, I'm really comfortable with the fact that we've got 7 options here and that we could push forward on the others, which include to some degree selling the same concept, but not so directly.
Great. Thank you.
Lauren, you want?
Yeah, I guess there's the question of general acceptance, and we don't know that. And we also don't know whether, it'd be interesting to know if the acceptance gets higher or lower depending on what, not just the cost, but also what the trade-offs are. We're going to have less water, and you can never have plans that require water or something. Does that change people's minds? Or, what other lifestyle trade-offs they're looking at?
I think part of the part of the equation of community acceptance is, I think what you call aesthetics, which includes taste and odor.
Correct.
So I don't know if you can shed some light on, you mentioned that you might need to add minerals. Is it odorless and tasteless before that? And I assume it's different in the groundwater scenario and in the direct reuse scenario.
Correct.
I don't know if you can speak to that.
It's going to the water quality that you're starting off with. The concerns that we've heard from or centered around groundwater use is that there's a like a mineral-y taste that is different than, say, the SFPUC Hetch Hetchy water. Or sometimes there can be a musky smell associated with groundwater that isn't always associated with SFPUC or Hetch Hetchy water.
So I think that will be a source of community pushback, even if even if the community is psychologically totally okay with certainly the groundwater supply, if it doesn't smell and taste as good as we're used to, or if it has a color tinge, I think there will be a lot of community pushback.
Okay.
And if those issues disappear in the direct reuse scenario, with a decade to work on it and a lavish educational campaign, it might actually be an attractive alternative if the water, because if the water tastes better.
You know, since there was an if in your statement, I'd just chime in and say, you're exactly right. So if we do indirect, where we pump it to the groundwater, they'd be essentially drinking groundwater, and it would have that relatively high mineral content that our groundwater around here has. If it were direct potable, then you'd be drinking what came out of the RO system, which can be fine-tuned to be very close to the mineral content of Hetch Hetchy water. So you're exactly right. You didn't need to say if. It would work in that direction.
I see.
Questions?
So I may have missed it, but I think I heard you say that there are cities in Southern California who are currently using the indirect potable water. Is there anybody that's using direct?
No.
So we would be the beta version.
Correct. There is nobody in the United States that is using direct potable.
Well, I don't think you need to worry about Palo Alto being the first, or Southern California will be the first to do that, just like they were the first to use indirect potable. And they will do that at some point. So you don't have to worry about that we'd be the first. What we're talking about is something that's, like was said, at least 10, maybe more likely 20 years away before we'd be doing direct potable. And remember that the other feature of this is you're really trying to focus on Palo Alto appropriately. We have our other 5 partners. They may be using this water for, you know, who knows what. And Mountain View is thirstier, to use Carla's word, than Palo Alto is. So just like they have a more exhaustive non-potable system than Palo Alto does, they'll probably be ahead of the use for other purposes too.
Well, I think having other communities who are experimenting with this is going to go a long way to satisfying community concerns. And if the Yelp reviews on drinking direct potable water are okay, I think people in Palo Alto will at least be willing to give it a shot.
Hi, Randy Rains, also with the consultant team. I just want to add one thing. I've been working with the City of San Diego for the last 5 to 10 years looking at potable reuse. And as you recall, or as you may recall, back in the 90s, they had the whole toilet to tap controversy and all that kind of thing. But they came to the conclusion over the last period of time that they do have to do major water recycling to meet their water supply needs. And for a long time, they were looking at taking the water about 30 miles to the east to a reservoir, and this is advanced treated recycled water, basically an indirect potable reuse option going to a reservoir as opposed to the groundwater. But recently, more recently, in the last few years, they've decided that it would be a lot more cost effective and the water would taste a lot better even and be a higher quality if they just did direct potable reuse. So they're going through a whole series of pilot testing now and working with the state regulators, and they're planning to pursue a potable reuse type option. Direct potable reuse.
So I think that's really interesting, and that's something we obviously have to keep a very close eye on. The other thing that I noticed on the chart, on the slide that shows how much potable water, or Hatch-Hatchie water, if you will, we save for these various alternatives, we really only save Hatch-Hatchie water if we're in the 4 alternatives on the right.
Correct, and those are the potable reuse alternatives.
Using the non-potable water for landscaping and whatnot really doesn't save us any potable water, given the fact that, and maybe water is not such a scarce resource for us as it is in other communities, but it's a scarce resource, and I think if we're going to do something, we want to do something that will actually save us some potable water. And I think the community would support that.
But I also think it's psychologically attractive. I think the idea, to use Terry's point about the fact that, now recycling is such a common thing, the idea that you're recycling water and doing that, I think is just very appealing to people. And I think one of the things that's interesting when you look at sort of the whole utility smart, what you're doing, space, okay, is that water tends to be one of those things that people are almost saying more, like leak detection is a really valuable benefit of AMI for water that people really get and grasp, because it's very easy to see water being wasted where it's harder to see electricity being. So again, I think in terms of customer engagement, we should use this as a vehicle to engage customers in being more environmentally aware.
And since you're an educator, can I just add a thought that we're doing now with school kids, which is focusing on the water cycle. And, we start with that, and we say, there's no new water in the last, I can't remember how many billion years we say, but it's all recycled. All the water use is recycled. So if we have an understanding of that, then it's less of a jump to move to the idea that we're recycling this particular water. So we're starting kids with cycle.
All right. So when we look at potable decision about some future, people would get based on necessity and other communities doing it. I agree with Lisa that taste and odor are very important. We have great water, far superior, say, to Los Altos, and barely drink it when I visit with my mom. I can't, actually. So I think that would be important to people. When we look at this chart, the bar chart there, you said at the outset that we're only considering this evening 3 sources of water, and other things like gray water and whatnot are not part of that. They potentially could impact the demand for potable water, right? There may be other contributors to the solution.
Just one thing to add about the long-term versus short-term idea, and there are, even though we wouldn't implement direct potable reuse anytime in the near future, there are things we can do to set ourselves up for that in the future. And so hearing this kind of feedback of, it's not completely off the table. We're not, I think what I'm hearing from all of you, or what I'm not hearing from any of you is, no, absolutely not. This community is never going to be able to deal with the concept of direct potable reuse. So hearing that lets us know, okay, as we get into the details of some of these projects that we'll be bringing back to you, some of them are more, leave the option open down the road better than others for direct potable reuse. So that's really valuable for us to hear.
Okay.
Thank you.
That probably gave you what you wanted from us, right? And
yes.
I want to add the compliments. This chart was terrific. Great presentation on a very complex subject. Really appreciate it from both of you.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, you have another slide
Well,
here,
I think if we're trying to wrap up, maybe just touching on the regional transfer concept would be a good place to end on. So there's one more water reuse opportunity that we want to gauge or get your feedback on at this time, and that's the concept of a regional transfer. Right now, the Santa Clara Valley Water District is doing a countywide water reuse master plan where they are evaluating different ways that regional transfers amongst the wastewater treatment plants in Santa Clara County can work together to provide water reuse in different areas. So for the city of Palo Alto, a regional transfer concept would be that the city would transfer a portion of its treated wastewater or recycled water to the Santa Clara Valley Water District for use elsewhere in the county. And so some benefits of that real quick are that it would utilize a large amount of water from the Regional Water Quality Control Plant. There's a lot of discussion going on about that, so the feeling that it could actually occur in the next 5 to 10 years is significant. And some obstacles, though, to note is that if a regional transfer occurs, the amount of water that is available for use within the city of Palo Alto would be restricted for the life of that contract. So at this point, we wanted to get your opinion or some feedback on whether or not we should reserve a portion of the city of Palo Alto's wastewater or recycled water for city of Palo Alto uses, or if we should be open to a long-term contract that would include a water transfer outside of the city.
Is it fair to say this is a real quantitative-based decision? And
Correct.
You've been helping us with conceptual answers, but not really quantitative data that would help address that question.
Right. So at this...
Oh, let me try that one. You're right. And the kind of backdrop of question number one is that we would certainly preserve what we can estimate now as the local needs. And just to give you a rough idea of it, about 50% of the water that the regional plant produces, we would definitely preserve for local uses. We've made rather conservative estimates for the next 10 years of what's needed. What's more difficult for us is to predict way beyond that. You have to make a lot of assumptions, and it gets really fuzzy after about 10 years. But we would definitely preserve about 50% of the flow for needs which are not actually being used now, but where we can project that, say, for the next 10 years, they would be needed. And the district doesn't like that. The district says, oh, you're not using that much water. You can certainly let us have more than 50%, and that's a subject of some tension, but we're very firm on that we've made these estimates. Yes, they're conservative, but so that if we had a longer text for you there, we'd probably say something like, should we preserve more than what we can estimate in the near term, or should we try to make some projection all the way out to the kind of numbers the district wants, which is like a 60-year contract, or should we just have a shorter contract? So that's kind of the real world that we're facing, is length of contract and how conservative to be in the number, weighing those.
Just to add to what Phil said, I think when he's talking about this 50% that we would keep for local needs, that would include as much non-potable reuse that we could possibly get to happen in the city. But when we start talking about indirect potable reuse or direct potable reuse, that's when we get this clash between keeping it here and using that large quantity of water here versus agreeing to a water transfer where it will be used in other parts of the county. I mean, that's the good thing about doing that. The south part of the county needs the water, the district wants the water, so we would be more certain of it being put to good use, which just from a regional water, community member is a good thing to make sure that this water is being put to good use. But it's always a little dubious to be giving up a resource for a long period of time. And the district will be making significant capital investments, and so they have an interest in knowing that that water will be there for a long time. So it's a tricky problem, and we're trying to represent the city in the best way possible, but also be regional community members and think about this resource and how it can be used the best way possible.
So you were leaning over your button. Did you want to say?
Oh, I just had a quick clarifying question of transfer. That for free, or is that selling the water?
It would compensate in a way, or dollars per foot or some other mechanism, but yeah, we're not considering giving it away for free.
Well, this is kind of off between, how short a contract can you get versus how much do you hold back for our use? And I suppose there's some way to, maybe there's some way to say, well, we'll give you this much water for 30 years and this amount for 60 years or whatever you need. I mean, obviously, getting some return on that water would be helpful during the time period while we're still making a decision and developing the technology to use it ourselves. But I think making sure that we have an ample amount reserved 20, 30 years down the road for our use would make sense.
Just an added thought is that the three legs of the stool are kind of how long it is, how much it is, and what are the conditions? Are there off-ramps for us? Like you say, it could be established with phases. It could be established with conditions that would look like off-ramps. So if such and such happens, then the deal's off. Or if such and such happens, we renegotiate the amount or the price. And so, as you can imagine, our current feedback to the district is we need a fair number of those conditions / off-ramps in there. And while they don't object to the concept, they're going to object to our next volley of conditions and off-ramps, as you can imagine. So that is another major part of the equation is what would those off-ramps and conditions be?
Very helpful, thank you. I'll just add my point. 60 years or 40 it's a long time, given the climate uncertainty ahead of us. Won't be my problem, but much shorter time period would make sense, or very strong off-ramps. I think, did you want to say anything, Terry?
Oh, I was going to demand that Phil come back to the mic. We've got partners, 5 of them in the sewage treatment plant?
That's right, Terry, 5.
What role are they playing in these negotiations?
Well, Mountain View, of course, is actually the biggest partner, bigger than Palo Alto.
Yeah.
So they're playing a major role. And, but they have said to us, look, we don't want to sit in on all these meetings. And so we're comfortable setting up an agreement between Palo Alto, who owns and operates the sewage treatment plant, and the district. So that's the direction we're heading, with close communication with Mountain View on the details of the negotiations. The others, we're not pulling in right now to the details of the negotiations. What we're saying is, and the district understands, I think, this principle, that one of the conditions that is necessary is that we, after the agreement is signed, because they want to do that in the near term, and we do too, well, we can't deal with all of our partners in the near term. Some of them require a lot of education on anything new, a lot of back and forth at the elected official level. So we're saying that could take us 2 years. So what we're saying right now is we'll go back, we'll commit to initiating agreement modifications with the partners, and to the maximum extent, John's words were good faith efforts. We'll make good faith efforts to secure those agreements within 2 years. They won't like that, but that's sort of where we currently are. But we definitely, it's a second step to deal with our partners, except for Mountain View.
I've got some sentiment here that you're fine? Yeah, you had your question answered, that we should move on. Really appreciate the presentation. I don't like 60 years, but that's...
but that is important feedback. We like hearing the feedback.
That's very scary.
Well, my support for this is contingent on Phil being around to blame him in 60 years.
Well, I just want to voice the opinion that I think I would not be alone in Palo Alto in trying to take a big picture view of the larger community outside of Palo Alto, and if there's a good use for this water today, it's certainly worth exploring.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
Now, Ed whispered to me that we could postpone item 4.
Yes, we could lay that over for your next meeting.
And do I hear any objections if we're doing that? No. Expecting none. Great. The last agenda item is if anyone to make comments on the rolling calendar. I know Ed has told me before they have a lot of work coming up.
Yes,
and,
please don't feel
it's not
obligated
working
to add
for,
anything to the
yeah.
plate.
Okay. All right. Well, I think you've mentioned many topics today that will come in, reports coming forward. So for no particular, AC, you're still looking thoughtful, no particular.
Reading our work plan.
You can't help but look thoughtful. Huh? Okay.
I'm sure we have plenty to do.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Can I say one more thing?
Please, Lisa.
Well, I just wanted to express appreciation for the memorandum that's not a discussion topic, but it's just kind of keeping us posted on legislative matters.
Yes.
So thanks for including that, even though it's not a discussion topic. It's very helpful to have. Now I move to adjourn.
All right. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Thank you, folks.